Talked about the meaninglessness of secular wisdom. He has full arguments of all of these. You can go home later and you can read this for yourself. I'm just going to touch on the very end of his arguments. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. The Net Bible reads, "For with great wisdom comes great frustration. Whoever increases his knowledge merely increases his heartache." Meaninglessness of self-indulgent pleasure. This is from chapter 2, verse 2, from the NIV. Now he says laughter, but when he says laughter has different interpretations. I think NIV went a little bit different direction here. This is more of a kind of partying kind of laughter. It's kind of it's a different meaning than what you immediately think of about laughter. It's a different kind of idea. So you could say partying, I said. It's madness. What does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine. You could substitute any kind of alcohol, trying to cheer yourself up. Embracing folly. My mind still guiding me with wisdom, I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. So he's saying, going out, enjoying your senses to the maximum, ultimately has no real value. The meaninglessness of materialism. This is from chapter 2, verse 10, I believe. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil, all of my work. Verse 11. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, chasing after the wind, accomplishing nothing. Nothing was gained under the sun. Under the sun just means throughout all their life's work. The meaninglessness of being a workaholic. This is something I really slide into. Something-aholic, whether it's study or whatever. This is something really easy for me. All of them we slide into very naturally. This is verse 17, chapter 2, verse 17. So I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. It pained me. All of it is meaningless, chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I toiled for under the sun because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. Verse 19. Who knows? And this is ironic, given that this is attributed to Solomon. And you know that his son did completely waste all of his work. By waste, meaning he split the kingdom very soon upon becoming king, his own son. Verse 19, and who knows whether that person who gets everything that I have when I die, the person who inherits everything I've done, who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish, yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. Verse 20, so my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. Verse 21, for a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. Verse 22, what do people get for all the toil and anxious striving for which they labor under the sun? 23, all their days their work is grief and pain. Even at night their minds do not rest. I'm sure we've experienced that from all the struggles and all the stresses we have in life. Sometimes we can't even sleep. What he's saying here, the teacher is saying that I've done great things, and I'm incredibly wealthy because of the things that I've done. But ultimately, it has no value. So pursuing accomplishment, increasing our wisdom, increasing our knowledge, becoming more and more educated, trying to enjoy ourselves as much as we possibly can, accumulating wealth, passing it on to our children, and the very, broad scheme of things, he's saying, is ultimately having no benefit. Regarding this, as a kid, when I read this, I thought this was the funniest thing I had ever read. I was such a depressed, morose kid that I just got kicks reading it. I just thought, this guy also thinks it has no value either. However, that's not what he's talking about at all. And that's how you need to understand what he's talking about. Everything I just said, he's setting up this other scenario. Okay? You have to remember that's what he's saying. All right? He's talking about something that does have no value, because he's talking about it without, in mind, living in the fear of God. We usually fall into this way of thinking. It's really easy, and that's why we don't like to read it, because we naturally start to think this way. I do very, very quickly. We get focused on our work, accomplishing things, pleasing our boss, making sure our kids are ready for their exams, making sure our kids are ready for life, making enough money to cover our overhead, cover our different expenses, putting food on the table, taking care of parents or your parents' bills, pleasing our wives, pleasing our boss. And sometimes they can be the same thing. We get so wrapped up in our work that we lose sight of how God thinks and what we're supposed to be doing. So what ends up happening when we're living like this and thinking in this way, we stop enjoying life. We stop enjoying family. We stop enjoying even work. We stop enjoying God, and not understanding that all those things are gifts from Him. So it can become real meaningless, real fast, even for Christians. Okay? Now, on the other extreme, I just talked about work. What about play? We can pursue pleasure and try to find fulfillment in pleasure. I'm sure some of us have also tried this. You can lose yourself in drinking, partying, TV. For modern generations, computer games, we can get completely lost in these things. It's kind of, often I find from people I've known that get lost in this, they have already realized some of the meaninglessness, and they kind of escape into it. Now, if you're not a Christian, and you haven't been saved by God, the meaninglessness in this life is the best thing you're ever going to experience. This is as good as it gets. It won't get any better. So you might as well enjoy it. This is as good as it will ever be. Even as meaningless and as horrific life can be. Now, what is meaningful? What is he going to say is meaningful? My mom introduced me to reading as a kid, and she's a real avid reader, and I learned that love of books from my mother. But she would always do this thing where she would get a little bit stressed out maybe, and she would go and cheat and read the very end of the book, and it just drove me crazy. I couldn't handle it. Don't read the end of the book before you get there, but we're going to do that now. If you could open up to Ecclesiastes 12, at the end of the book, verse 13. This is the conclusion of everything he has to say. It's just, in my Bible, it's just these two lines here. So all of these things he said that sound horrifically depressing, this is the conclusion. Read it with me. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Simply, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. That just seems like the most anticlimactic ending in any book. That's it. He just stopped right there. Again, fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Wow. So, understanding this phrase, fear of God, is necessary to understand what the teacher means. What is the fear of God? It actually can mean terror. It does mean that. It does mean a literal fear. But many times it doesn't carry that meaning. In fact, most times it doesn't carry that meaning at all. It's kind of an archaic expression. We don't really identify well with fearing God in the modern church. The phrase is important. As many of you know, the fear of God can be interchanged with reverence or awe of God. I think most of us know that. So the fear of God, you can kind of swap it out sometimes for reverence, awe of God. Rather, I would say usually. Okay? Now, the fear of God is usually paired together with obedience, right? All throughout the Old Testament, fear of God and obedience kind of go hand in hand. The awe of God, the reverence of God, man recognizes it, and then he obeys God. This is found again throughout all the Old Testament. It's also tied together with wisdom. Proverbs 1:7, very famous verse. The beginning of wisdom and knowledge is the fear of God. The reverent awe of God produces wisdom. What we don't see as often is the fear of God is also tied with faith. And I think this is the most useful one to remember. If you remember, Abraham in Genesis 22 was asked to sacrifice his own son, to kill his own son, by God. Abraham knew that God had made a promise that Isaac would be the beginning of an entire nation of people. He knew God so well, and he trusted God so much that he absolutely knew that God would raise him from the dead. He had no qualms at all about doing what God said. He knew who God was. He knew that God had some ultimate purpose. And here, it's described as the fear of God. In the fear of God, Abraham acted faithfully. So the fear of God is tied to faith. So if you're trusting God and what he has promised you, and you're trusting God with the things you do in your life, then you are automatically fearing God. Okay? If you know that doing something, A, B, or C is a wrong thing to do, and you believe God that by not doing that is a good thing, and you don't do it, that is living in the fear of God. So the phrase is something you're probably more familiar with, but often we don't think about it in the right sense. So the fear of the Lord produces, 1, faith, obedience, and following that, wisdom. So again, if you're here, you're coming here and you're thinking the new year has some things ahead of you that are rightfully worrying. And I think most of us probably have some things that these things are not things that are comfortable to think about, but they're coming up soon. You're thinking, I have no energy left, I can only handle so much. I have no strength to continue. What is the meaning of all these things I'm required to do? Or perhaps you're not that bad off at all. Perhaps you're just looking at how unsatisfying success is, or unsatisfying wealth, pleasure, and knowledge alone can be, and you're asking again, what's the meaning of this? Is there any meaning in this life at all? Can it be found? And again, the teacher summarizes that answer. There is meaning in living a life in fear of the Lord. What is the fear of the Lord? The reverent awe of God. The reverent awe that leads to faith, leading to obedience, leading to wisdom. Now, what is the most interesting to me, one commentator put it like this, and I'll paraphrase him. The question that the book of Ecclesiastes asks, what is the meaning of life, and provides the answer, living in the fear of God. This is the introduction to the entire Bible.